The train car fell silent. Every passenger turned to stare as the little girl in the torn dress stood frozen in the aisle, tears streaming down her face, clutching an old, crumpled envelope to her chest. The man in the navy suit, silver-haired, jaw set like carved granite, had just risen from his seat and pointed at her like she was something that didn't belong, like she was dirt that had somehow wandered onto his clean floor. "Get her off this train," he said. Cold, final, as if she were nothing. And she was removed, just like that. A 10-year-old child put off at the next stop alone on a platform in the middle of nowhere, watching the gleaming doors slide shut. What no one on that train knew, what even that little girl didn't fully understand yet, was that the envelope she was holding contained a legal document. A document that entitled her to 50% of every company that man had ever built or ever would build. But how did a poor girl in a torn dress end up holding that kind of power? Let's go back to the beginning. Her name was Amara. She had grown up in a two-room apartment on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered and the pipes rattled in winter, and nobody ever seemed to have quite enough of anything. Her mother, Grace, had worked as a seamstress, nimble-fingered and tireless, sewing buttons and hemming trousers for people who would never once think to ask her name. Amara had inherited her mother's quiet strength. She was the kind of child who noticed everything, the way the sunrise turned the cracked window gold for exactly 4 minutes every morning, the way her mother hummed while she worked, even when she was exhausted, even when her fingers ached, because humming was the one thing that nobody could take from her. Grace had been gone for 2 years now, pneumonia, the doctor said, as if the cold apartment and the uninsured medical bills and the 12-hour shifts had nothing to do with it, as if poverty didn't have its own particular way of making people sick. After the funeral, Amara had been taken in by her great-aunt Ruth, a stout, no-nonsense woman who smelled of lavender and kept her home meticulously tidy despite having very little. It was Aunt Ruth who had pressed the old envelope into Amara's hands the morning she set out on that train. "Your mother kept this safe for years," Ruth had told her, her voice low and careful. "It's for the man who used to work with your grandfather, a man named Whitmore. You find him, you give him this, and you let the lawyers do the rest. You hear me?" Amara had nodded, not understanding, not yet. She had only known that the envelope felt important, that her mother had kept it hidden in the lining of a coat, like a secret too precious to leave lying out in the open. Now the man named Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore was 63 years old and worth, at last count, somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion. He had built his first company from nothing, a logistics firm that grew, swallowed competitors, and multiplied. Then came the real estate ventures, the tech investments, the branded developments bearing his name on their facades in bold, polished letters. He was the kind of man who had assistants to manage his assistants, the kind of man who had not stood in a line for anything in over 2 decades. He was accustomed to being the most important person in every room he entered. He was not accustomed to being questioned. He was absolutely not accustomed to children in torn dresses boarding the same train as him. That morning he had boarded the express in a dark mood. A board meeting had run long. His lawyers had delivered news that a dormant partnership agreement, when he had assumed long buried, had resurfaced. Someone had filed paperwork. Someone was claiming equity in companies he had built from the ground up, companies he had poured his life into. He didn't know who, he didn't know how. He only knew that it made his blood run cold. He had settled into his first-class seat and opened his briefcase. And then there she was, the little girl in the torn dress moving through the carriage, looking for a seat. Amara had chosen her seat carefully, a quiet window seat near the back of the car, away from the clusters of business people with their laptops and their coffee cups. She had pressed her face to the glass and watched the city give way to fields, yellow and wide under the autumn sky. She had tucked the envelope carefully in her lap and thought about her mother, and the way Grace used to say that everything finds its way eventually, like water through stone. She did not notice the silver-haired man watching her from 3 rows ahead. Gerald Whitmore had noticed the envelope the moment she sat down. It was old, visibly old, the kind of age that came from years of careful storage. not neglect. And stamped on its face was a seal he recognized instantly, even from a distance. The seal of Carver and Associates, the law firm that had handled his very first partnership agreement 40 years ago. The firm that had drafted the contract he had spent the last week praying had simply ceased to exist. His jaw tightened. His hands went still over his open briefcase. Who was this child? Where had she come from? And why was she sitting 3 rows away from him on this particular train, carrying what appeared to be a very particular piece of paper? He told himself he was being paranoid. He looked away. He looked back. The girl was just staring out the window, peaceful and small, and completely unaware of his attention. And then a train attendant passed through the car, and Whitmore did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He flagged the attendant down. He lowered his voice. That child, he said, gesturing. She doesn't have a first-class ticket. Remove her. The attendant looked uncertain. Sir, if she just needs to move to another, remove her from the train at the next stop, Whitmore said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. This is a private first-class carriage. She doesn't belong here. He didn't wait to see what happened next. He turned back to his papers and told himself it was nothing. A coincidence. A strange girl with an old envelope and no business being in his carriage. But the thing about willful blindness is that it doesn't make the truth disappear. It only delays the moment you have to face it. What Whitmore didn't know, what he had chosen not to investigate too carefully, because some silences are more comfortable than the truth, was the story of a man named Elijah Carver. Elijah had been Gerald Whitmore's first business partner. They had been young together, ambitious together, hungry together. It was Elijah who had put up the initial capital for the very first venture. It was Elijah who had worked beside Gerald through the 18-hour days and the near bankruptcies and the moments when quitting would have been so much easier than staying. Together they had built something real. Together they had signed an agreement, 50-50, down the line, for everything that followed. And then Elijah had gotten sick. And Gerald, 29 years old and terrified of losing everything he had just begun to build, had done the thing he would never speak of afterward. He had restructured, quietly, carefully, with the help of lawyers who knew how to make paperwork disappear. He had convinced himself that Elijah's share was only meant for the first company, that the language of their agreement didn't truly extend forward, that it was cleaner for everyone this way. Elijah had died believing his family was protected. He had not lived long enough to know that the protections had been quietly dismantled. But his daughter Grace had known, and she had kept the original agreement, the one that predated the restructuring, the one with both signatures and the full forward-reaching language intact, sewn into the lining of a coat for 20 years, waiting for the right moment, waiting until the truth had enough weight behind it to hold. Now the truth was sitting on a train platform, crying quietly with an envelope in her hands, and Gerald Whitmore's train was pulling away. He should have felt relief. He told himself he felt relief. He turned back to his papers and ordered a coffee and watched the countryside blur past the window. But here's the thing about the truth. It has a way of arriving whether you open the door for it or not. 3 days later, the lawyers came. They arrived at his office with a courtesy that barely disguised its teeth. 2 attorneys from a firm he had never heard of, representing a minor child named Amara Carver, the granddaughter of Elijah Carver, deceased formerly of Carver and Associates. They placed a certified copy of the original partnership agreement on his desk. They placed beside it a letter, handwritten in a careful, precise hand that Grace had written in the last weeks of her life. Gerald Whitmore read it in silence. Grace's letter did not rage. It did not threaten. It simply told the truth in the quiet, steady way of someone who had made peace with their anger a long time ago. She wrote about her father. She wrote about what he had built and what had been taken. She wrote about the years she had spent working and struggling and holding on to that document because letting go of it would have felt like letting go of her father's legacy, like agreeing that he hadn't mattered. And then she wrote something that made Gerald Whitmore set the letter down and stare at the wall for a very long time. She wrote, "I am not asking you to feel guilty. I am only asking you to make it right. Not for me, for my daughter. She has never had anything handed to her. She has never asked for anything that wasn't already owed. The legal process took 4 months. Whitmore's first instinct had been to fight. His attorneys were confident. 40 years was a long time. Documentation had a way of expiring. Courts had a way of favoring the living over the dead. He sat in his boardroom with his counsel arrayed around him and told himself this was just another negotiation, just another deal. But every night when he got home, he found himself sitting in the dark of his study, thinking about a little girl standing on a train platform, crying, holding an envelope she had carried all the way from the east side of the city because her dead mother had believed that truth had a shelf life of forever. He thought about Elijah, about the way Elijah used to laugh, a big, full laugh that took over his whole face, about the handshake they had shared on the day they signed their agreement, young and terrified and absolutely certain that they were going to build something extraordinary together. They had. He just hadn't been willing to share it. On the 42nd day of the legal proceedings, Gerald Whitmore asked his lawyers to stop, to stand down, to cease all opposition. They looked at him like he had lost his mind. Draw up the settlement, he said. Honor the agreement, all of it. The settlement was comprehensive. 50% equity in every active company bearing any lineage to that original partnership, valued in total at just under $2 billion, was placed in a trust in Amara Carver's name to be managed by independent trustees until she came of age. In addition, a substantial educational fund was established, and an endowment in Elijah Carver's name was created to support young entrepreneurs from under-resourced communities. On the day the papers were signed, Gerald Whitmore asked if he could meet her. Amara was 10 years old, and she sat across from him in a room full of lawyers with the same quiet steadiness her mother had described in that letter. She wore a new coat, not torn, and her hands were folded in her lap, and she looked at him with eyes that were serious and direct and entirely without malice. He had prepared something to say, some carefully constructed apology that his PR team had probably already begun workshopping. But sitting across from this child, with her mother's dignity and her grandfather's name, the prepared words shriveled up and died. What he said instead was this: I knew your grandfather. He was the best person I ever worked with. I'm sorry it took me this long to say so. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly but clearly, my mom said you'd figure it out eventually. The room was silent. And Gerald Whitmore, billionaire, 4-time cover story, a man who had not cried in front of another person in 30 years, pressed his hand to his mouth and looked away. The envelope Amara had carried across the city on that autumn morning now sits in a glass frame, displayed in the main hall of the Elijah Carver Foundation's headquarters, a building that bears her grandfather's name and funds the dreams of young people who grew up, as he once did, knowing the particular ache of being brilliant in a world that isn't ready to see it. Amara is 26 now. She sits on 3 boards. She runs a scholarship program that has sent over 400 students to university. And she keeps on the desk in her office a photograph of her mother, Grace, needle in hand, humming at her sewing table, unaware that she was quietly holding everything together. Because some people carry the truth with them for decades, through poverty and loss, in the particular exhaustion of being overlooked. And they carry it not out of bitterness, but out of love. Love for the people who came before them, and faith in the people who will come after. The world will always have men who believe that removing someone from their space is the same as removing them from the story. But the story was never his to own.